Firstly, thank you so much for coming. It's been my absolute pleasure over the last 3 days to work with these 26 talented young people. So we've been working on the Treasury's Living Standards framework, which will all become apparent in what we're going to be doing over the next kind of 6 items. Over the last 3 days, we've all got into different groups and met lots of new people and explored our own ideas. So, as you can see from the beautiful photo. But yeah, I think first of all we're going to get started. I'm going to ask the 3 people to come up and give us a bit of context on the case studies that we first looked at to apply the Living Standards framework to.
The first case study that we looked at was assessing King Salmon's application under the RMA to expand their fields in the Marlborough Sounds. And so what we did is we used the framework, which has 5 separate parts, and to assess the policy around that and to examine what issues should be considered. So obviously the most obvious considerations are economic. So what we wanted to do was use the framework to try and expand that. And one of the main factors that came up were for under sustainability, issues around pollution from sewage and the excess feed, which floats down to the bottom. So that's one of the considerations we wanted to take into account. For social infrastructure, it was the potential of incorporating the consultation of iwi into the agreement, which has happened in the past and could potentially be a way in the future, so something just to consider. For equity, it was what benefits would flow on from the agreement and where would those be distributed, so in the local community. And also for managing risk, we wanted to expand the idea of that, so not just about managing economic risk, but also about managing these other factors. And one of the main things that we came up with was trying to put in place procedures where the advancement of technological developments that could potentially reduce pollution and being able to put that through in the agreement or in some way incorporate it, and also an expansion of research ideas to make us more aware of what those problems are. So that's how we use the framework, and that's kind of what it looked like for our first case study. Thank you.
And so the next case study we're going to be moving on to is... Who's doing the housing one? All right, well, I can jump in and do the housing one. So the second case study we looked at was to do with housing, with a particular focus on kind of the social aspect. I know throughout the 4 groups we all took different aspects on it. So I know my group personally, we looked at what we decided to call the filter and the carrot. So we looked at people, essentially stopping people from going into the system, and then also how do we get people out. One of the other groups, 2 groups actually, focused on our ageing population. So they looked at, New Zealand has got, lots of people retiring and entering into that kind of sector. And the last group, can't remember what they looked at, but overall I think what came out of doing the housing one in particular, which was a lot more in depth in the first case study, was actually to do with what we couldn't use out of the framework. So basically, the framework is a pentagon. It's got 5 sections. There's increasing equity, sustainability, social infrastructure, economic growth, and managing risk. So that was actually the first case study I think that most groups encountered, that there was an element that was missing, and that kind of reflected back on health and culture. And then we've got Nish doing teaching.
So case study 3 was all about the education standards in New Zealand. And once again, all the groups worked using the living standards, but we all, again, had different outcomes. So one of the groups focused on the gap going between high school into university and how it's such a big difference, like in the way it's taught and everything. A second group worked on going from university into getting a job, so getting a degree and then having struggled to find a career afterwards. And then my group personally talked about teaching and how the teachers kind of teach, and how we designed it with a bridge. So we talked about how there's 3 different types. There's the tail, which we called, which is the ones which are just unmotivated and just don't really want to be there. the job descriptions, which are the ones that just follow, just do the job, and then the ones which go out and above, so all the teachers which go out and above. And this was a really strong case study, which personally I loved because I'm going to Teachers College next year, so it's real good to just get advice from it and see what everyone thought about teaching and thought about the education standards. So yeah, it's awesome.
Awesome. So, the next part that we're moving on to is we're going to be looking at the metaphor of the living standards that came up with.
Hello everyone. And so our group came up with a youth statement, and we came up with a metaphor that underpinned our youth statement, and this is how we, from this creative metaphor that we have done, we founded all our basic principles and how we found our youth statement should be worded. And so the metaphor begins with our dreams and ambitions, and here is where people want to end up: their personal fulfillment, their goals in life, their aspirations. And the line here represents where people begin, from youth, from young, starting out, have all their goals and aspirations ahead of them. And the journeys in the past show how people get to their dreams and ambitions. As you can see, the paths are not always straight, they're not curved, they're all crooked, and it's gonna take a while for people to get to here. And you can see that not everybody starts from the starting line, and it's not an equal playing field. And some start at the back due to socio-economic factors, some start ahead, and some start just before the line. And I think an example that really illustrates this is that of Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who was America's first Latina Supreme Court judge. And so Justice Sotomayor was a product of a policy, Justice Sotomayor got into Princeton and graduated with highest honors because of a policy whereby Princeton was made to go out to underprivileged schools and take the brighter students from those schools and bring them into Princeton. And from that, she was able to reach her dreams of ambition and get to a high point in life. And and she writes in her book a really positive line that I think really illustrates this, is that how could she have begun a race that she didn't even know from the start was being run? And that is our metaphor.
Living standards will be higher in 2058 if the government delivers to us
Freedom.
Tangata whenua.
Innovation.
Community and family.
Environmental concern.
political sustainability.
Though we as New Zealanders all embark on alternative journeys, it is the role of public policy to lighten the path. This means ensuring every individual finds the beginning of that pathway and has the means to reach their own ideal of happiness. To achieve this ideal, the pathway needs to encompass equal opportunity, quality education, and sustainable economy, built on foundations of equity and the recognition of diversity within New Zealand.
It is true intelligence for a man to take something which is great and mysterious within itself and to unfold it and simplify it so that a child can understand. For me, the New Zealand economy is great and mysterious. However, we have this framework, and me personally, I think it's a good framework. Over the last 3 days, we have stress tested this framework with a few case studies, as Erin so beautifully put before. And what we've come up with is that there's positives to the framework. There's grey areas, and there's also things that can be improved of the framework.
So the way we did this was through the case studies we've talked about, and we basically begun by asking questions about the questions that we were asking faced with this case study, and from there we were able to see which questions we were asking and which questions we weren't but should have been, and seeing whether the framework was prompting us towards that vision of living standards that we just shared with you. So one of the first indicators that's really sort of well established is economic growth. Now we found it relatively easy applying the element of economic growth to evaluating policy options, in that we were all on the same page about what questions to ask and which key indicators to look at. And that's partly due to the pre-existing paradigm within economics and within policy making that has had an influence on how we look at growth. For example, we all ask the same questions around how will the implications of policy X affect GDP, employment, productivity, and all those other things. So being on the same page and having an understanding really helped us be on the same page and made analysis so much easier.
Another vital dimension of the framework is sustainability. Now, sustainability is important because it's part of our cultural thing of being clean and green. It's not just a marketing scheme for tourism purposes, it is our cultural identity, our national identity. And it's 100% pure New Zealand. And the economic benefits from exploiting our natural resources often lead to unsustainable practices which are detrimental to our native lands. So protecting and preserving them is very important for us. There's also the cultural aspect of it. The native people of this land is the Māori. This is their sacred land, so we have to respect it. And this can be seen in one of the case studies we had where the king salmon farmers were consulting with local iwi in concerns to their practices and regulations. There's also the issue of intergenerational inequity. So that is, are we entitled to the resources more so than future generations? So our perspective is that we shouldn't be allowed to deplete our resources now and leave not much for future generations, because that would be unsustainable. So the sustainability of any policy themselves must be compliant with both sustainability and intergenerational inequity.
One of the grey areas of the framework that we've worked out was this notion of equity. We found it so grey and quite confusing based on the fact that how do you define equity? Or it's quite ambiguous. So I have an analogy for you to better understand our understanding of equity. Now imagine a fence, and you have a tall person and a very short person. Now, equality on this left-hand side here is addressed when you provide both people with the same sized box. However, the short person doesn't actually get to see over the fence. With equity, we see it as you provide the shorter person with a bigger box, and therefore they both get to see over the fence. This is important because in equality, you limit yourself to how much freedom you can provide people. Society needs to be constrained and has its limits, has to be docile in order to, for people to live happily amongst each other. With equity, it is very important, even though it is a weak part of the framework, it should be, and it should still be part of the framework because, as we can see, in a nutshell, everybody gets to see the game. It's important that everybody gets to have higher living standards in New Zealand?
In regard to the area of managing risk, and so we found we kind of had a few issues around what is managing risk and it being more than just economic risk and things. And so we've kind of moved, what we thought was kind of moving to an idea of improving resilience, which can go across all sectors. And so the key issues that we found with managing risk were that it kind of presented a set of predetermined analysis and factors with constricted outcomes and resulted in kind of a risk-adverse society on the whole. And so with that, we're distancing ourselves from risk rather than kind of engaging and also enjoying the risk. And so benefits from kind of adopting an improving resilience kind of model. We found that fundamentally this is to find strength in times of weakness and look at how we can engage with risk. So harnessing growth that is available no matter where in the economic cycle you are or whatever project you're in. And so we kind of came up with a bit of an analogy of creating bounce within the economy or within your project. So factors of bounce. We can't predict all the areas of risk, but we can predict the padding on which we land when we do fall, and we can reduce the friction in the air when we go back up. And that's where we can really engage with the risk that we're dealing with. So for New Zealand to take active risks is where we can have real improvements in living standards within New Zealand. Differing policies and the differing risks that those policies take, well, there must be realistic and critical evaluation as far as are these risks really going to enhance our resilience or do they simply make us vulnerable? And so I'm sure that across kind of these topics you can see there is a real issue across, where the differing factors and the balancing up the different factors.
In stress testing the framework, we found that the elements were often co-aligned and interactive with one another. So for example, in applying the housing case study to the framework, we found that when we increase the supply of housing increases, it influences economic growth as it utilises human capital to produce physical capital. This supply comes closer to meeting demand and lowers the house pricing, increasing equity as housing becomes more attainable. This relationship established a need for the framework to remain fluid and simple, with no restrictions or specific weighting to any of the elements. This has to be a balancing act to ensure the framework is broad yet effective, to produce fair resolutions and flow, ultimately achieving higher living standards.
Now, because of the problems we found in stress testing, we tried to come up with an innovative solution, one that sort of made sure that we didn't have the sort of cross-pollination of different ideas and not being able to separate them out. And so we thought that cultural elements specifically were not well encapsulated by the social infrastructure facet of the Living Standards framework, which was the one it kind of fell under. Therefore, we believe that a standalone cultural element is necessary to ensure that the New Zealand that's comprised of a very diverse population is represented by the framework. And this is a value dimension, very distinct from social infrastructure. We found when analysing the cases that certain outcomes didn't quite fit into any aspect of the framework. Issues, for example, of property rights, different interpretations of the family structure, and distinct ways of learning were split between existing dimensions of the framework, often some going into equity, some going into social infrastructure. And what this does is it undervalues those particular issues when you can't look at them as a whole. So currently the framework's inclusion of culture is limited as well to a very traditional Crown versus Māori approach. It's centred on redressing past grievances. But this new element allows for foresight, the sixth cultural element, to preemptively trying to prevent a policy's negative impact on different cultures. Because we think that building culturally aware systems on top of shared value foundations will promote far more inclusiveness in our future society.
In terms of how culture affects the framework, we envisage policymakers assessing effects on cultures and values of those who will be directly affected by such policies. If we don't examine culture individually, it is both lost as an important outcome and it also weakens the validity of policy analysis. New Zealand as a nation has its own understandings and ways of doing things. This needs to be recognised and reflected in our national policy making.
Right, so as you can see in kind of the context that's been given about the case studies and the work done at reimagining the framework itself, it's clear that as we've been in groups, we've approached the framework and the various case studies from a wide range of different perspectives. And we've gained a kind of intimate knowledge of the way that it can function when applied to different situations. So when it came to thinking about how to envision the framework when it comes to delivering it to potential policy analysts, we decided it was important to take a step back and kind of look at the role that the framework plays in the process. So really taking it from a static two-dimensional image and looking at it as a kind of dynamic part of a process. So firstly, to kind of articulate the problem, the fact that, we move quite nicely, is that the world is very complicated. When the problems that policy analysts are presented with are complex, there are a large number of interrelating factors, and so the question is, how do we properly give due diligence to these various factors?
Yeah, so if you can imagine these lines here as representing all the ideas and information that sort of comes together and just becomes a whole bunch of noise. Essentially, they all have their own merits, but there is no real clear pathway. So that's where the prism comes in, and the prism acts as a lens, so to provide a bit of clarity and a bit of foresight, as we were mentioning before. And then from that prism, we can extract and identify the main issues, or the main factors that we need to work on, and also just allow us to better prepare ourselves for the future. So noise, lens, clarity.
So now we hope you understand what we've been up to over the past couple of days, and see how that lens can be applied from here on in. I'd also like to think it's quite important for us to note that lens of this diagram that we've come up with is also a fantastic metaphor for what we've been up to. Us 25 or so individuals came from all over New Zealand. We came in with our different values and understandings. We came together, collaborated, bounced ideas off each other, and formulated this fantastic document, and something that we hope can be applied not just through on the Living Standards framework, but for any public policy from here on in. And I think what's more important to note is I think Wendy was our lens. So thank you very much. Cheers, guys. Kia ora.
Maybe just ask Wendy and Ryan and where's
Renata?
Come on. So maybe come up quickly.
Is Annie in here?
And Kieran.
Don't get Annie.
So basically, we wouldn't be here, and we probably wouldn't still be surviving if it wasn't for these amazing people.
Come on, Ryan. Come on.
Don't worry, you'll be getting your individual time.
Kieran as well. So these guys have been like at our beck and call the last few days, and they have made this all possible, especially Wendy. Without her vision and without her drive to see improvement in public policy, I don't think any of this would be possible. And it's so amazing that there's someone there that is so passionate about that, and that we can all get involved and get to know each other and develop our own individual insights into that. So Wendy, I think we all really appreciate your work and everything you've done.
Next, I'd like to say a big thank you to Renata. She's basically become one of us for the last 3 days. I actually got to know Renata quite well last night at 12:30 when we were eating cold pizza here, and you've been so helpful, and you've listened to me rambling on for the past 2.5 days. So thank you so much for being approachable and being someone that I know everyone here feels like they can come talk to. So thank you so much.
Karen and Ryan, I think the way that you guys stay so calm when we've only got a few seconds or a few minutes to get things done. Oh, yeah. It's great. And
I was running around going, 5 minutes.
Oh, were you?
Oh, no.
Oh, no, yeah. So we had 10 minutes. So we had 10 minutes to go, and these guys are still sitting there just relaxed, just getting things done and just helping us to formulate these amazing outputs that we can now bring together. So thank you so much for that.
And last but not least, lovely Annie. Annie has been providing us with delicious food and drinks. She's been doing our name tags, gracefully decorating the office for the Christmas party, sat through the economics conference on Tuesday. It's been awesome having you around. So thank you so much for everything.
Just a little gift for the Institute. So it's from all of us, and you'll see, but it's sort of representative of the journey, I think, that you've helped us all to get on. And I think you've got us all on this walker, and now we can steer our own and see where we're going to go. But the way that you've brought us all together is really appreciated. So thank you.
I think probably everyone in the room can see and appreciate what an amazing 3 days we've had. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm really goosebumpy. That is absolutely stunning. And I can't believe the workshops seem to just kind of get better and better. And I don't know whether it's that people are just really wanting to engage in these kind of processes. And you came in with no agenda, nothing. Like, you didn't know what you were coming into, and you really you grabbed everything like sponges. You were wearing me out as your questions and your inquiry, and the people at the conference and the questions that you asked people. John Fitzgerald, for example, when you came and spoke. I mean, you guys are really going for it, and one of the exciting things I think is to be able to sit back a little bit and see the future of New Zealand here. It's really cool. So thank you very much.